Welcome back to a study of general biblical introduction. Unusual study in that we're taking a look at how we got the Bible. Studying the Bible is wonderful, but this is directed toward how we got it. And so we have an interesting journey in this kind of effort. It's the case that we've already taken a look at inspiration, verbal, plenary inspiration, a wonderful study of how God sent the message to especially chosen writers to make us aware of His will for us. And then we took a look at canonicity, those books in the Bible that we have. Are they all that we need? Are they all that God wanted us to have? And should we have any more books? And so on. That's canonicity. Which books belong in the rule, under the boundary of inspiration? Which books are canonized? And then we started a study in the last part of this section on general introduction on textual criticism. And we took a look at biblical preservation. How was the text preserved? Then we looked at some of those thoughts about Old Testament credibility. And in the last session, I began a study of New Testament credibility. And we first took a look at the evidence in those manuscripts that are called uncials. Those are large letter manuscripts. And as far as I know, and the last time I checked, there are about 275 of these manuscripts, and they date around AD 300 approximately. And they are all large letters. There are no paragraphs, there are no punctuation marks, there are just letters one right after another in so many columns. And these are codices, that is, they are in book form. And these uncials are an interesting study. And if you had a critical Greek New Testament, down at the bottom of each page there would be some capital letters. That would be the information concerning how many uncials have this particular reading, and so on. And so the textual critic studies these kinds of materials, and he is determining what the original line actually was. And so he's looking for the autograph. The autograph, of course, is the original, and we have none of those. And uncials were mostly on a kind of material that didn't last very long. In fact, oftentimes those who had these kinds of things threw them away or used them for cook fires. The Sinaiticus Codex, in fact, was found in a monastery because one of the cooks visited by a man named Tischendorf, one of the monks there, was using the leaves of this particular thing to get his cook fire started. Well, it was the Sinaiticus Codex. And then later on, when Tischendorf went back, almost a little over a decade later, he got a hold of the entire Bible in what is called the Sinaiticus. The reason it's called the Sinaiticus is that monastery where that monk was is St. Catherine's Monastery, and it's at the foot of the Mount Sinai. And so we have the name for that codex. It's the only one that doesn't have a capital letter naming it also. It is called Aleph, the first sound or letter of the Hebrew alphabet. But all of these uncials then, if you're looking in a critical testament, are lettered, capital letters. Well, we have, as I said, about 275 of those. But I want today to say some more about New Testament cursives. Cursives, writing. And there are minuscules. Those are smaller cursive manuscripts. And they are interesting because there are so many of them. They are later productions than the uncials. So if you see a cursive manuscript and you're a textual critic, you're going to know you have a later manuscript immediately. You have uncials from about the 3rd century, as I've already said, but they extend all the way to the 10th century. They are overlapping some of the minuscules then, as they were created. And most of our cursive manuscripts are minuscules, very small writing. The number of minuscule manuscripts is not very accurately calculated, evidently, because some of these collators or textual critics have different numbers when they talk about how many of these minuscules there are. Geisler lists in his book 2,745 minuscules, but Kenneth Lake, a collator, listed over 3,000. 46 minuscules contain the entire New Testament. That's interesting, and that's a wonderful thing when you're looking at how the original text might have or was. And in critical Greek testaments, these are given numbers. The uncials, remember, are given letters, but the minuscules are given numbers. And they're magnificent productions. They're wonderful to see. One of the minuscules, Codex 33, it's a book form, and it is so magnificent, and the decorations are so artistic that are on the covers and some of the pages, that this particular minuscule, Codex 33, is called the Queen of the Cursive Manuscripts. These are beautiful Bibles. It's an Alexandrian family manuscript, Codex 33 is. And while I'm thinking about it, when you talk about families, you have Byzantine, Caesarean, Alexandrian, for the most part. And these genre of families are recognized by the textual critic according to the corrections the scribes made when they were hand copying them. Isn't that interesting that the textual critic is able to recognize what the scribe was doing? They're so accurate in reading these manuscripts that they can tell you immediately, well, there was a scribe from that part of the world that was doing that one, because look at the corrections he made. And so in a critical New Testament, it will tell you the family. You'll see SCB or SCA and so on. And it's interesting that about 90% of the ones we have, these minuscules, are Byzantine family. And that's really the background of the King James Version Bible, is the Byzantine tradition of scribal corrections. The value of the cursives in terms of New Testament credibility, as far as critical scholarship is concerned, their value is considered to be less than the values of the uncials. They're later Bibles, not as early as the uncials, but for the most part, further removed from the autograph, and that seems to be logical, for sure, that the earlier manuscript you would think you would be much closer to what the autograph was. But here's a problem. A 13th century minuscule is possibly a copy of a 3rd century Greek uncial. And so it really is not a 13th century production. It's more closely related to a 3rd century production. But that would make it of more value than the Vaticanus or Sinaiticus, which are 4th century uncials. And so there is some discussion to be had about the minuscule evidence against the uncial evidence. Now, the idea behind one theory is, this is the Westcott-Hort theory of textual transmission. The idea behind their theory is that you have to use the two earliest Sinaiticus and Vaticanus uncials. These codex or codices or books are the earliest, they say, and so we should use those as the standard by which we gauge all other manuscript evidence. Well, what about that I just said? You might have a 13th century minuscule, but it's a copy of a 3rd century uncial. And so the textual critic knows that. So which would be more valuable, a 4th century uncial or a 3rd century minuscule? And so there are conflicts here a little bit about which is the best route to go when you're looking for the autograph. The number of years that a manuscript is removed from the autograph is not as critical a problem as some make it, simply because variations don't come from early or late. They come from scribal accuracy. And we've already talked about that in another session. But you remember that the scribe had to count the letters. He had to have so much space. He had to come out at a certain place on a certain page and so on. So they had all kinds of rules for copying these manuscripts. That's the problem. That's the critical question. Some of the minuscules agree more fully with the older uncials than the later uncials do with those former uncials. And so we have questions about which is best. One of the ways it helps me understand what the textual critic is doing is to think about what I do with my old Bibles. What do I do with them? Well, when they're worn out, it's because I use them a lot. Well, how come we find some of these uncials not being worn out? Did the original folks who had it know it wasn't as accurate as some other unseal? So there are all kinds of questions about this theory that the earlier is the better. Maybe, maybe not. But I'm indebted to the textual critic who has determined through a lot of hard work and a lot of discoveries and a lot of evidence what the autograph was. And that's a wonderful thing. And so when I have a recension, a critical Greek testament, then I know that the textual critic's been at work. The one I use in my work is the Curtilon text of the New Testament. That's the background of the American Standard Version, incidentally. But I do know that it is a little different from the background of the King James New Testament simply because the Curtilon theory was, let's use the two earliest manuscripts. But even then I have questions about that. That helps me understand why in Acts 8:37 the American Standard left out the confession of the eunuch. It's not in Vaticanus, it's not in Sinaiticus, but it belongs there. And a 3rd century uncial had it, and the minuscule tells us that. So you have questions when you're talking about textual criticism. But the overwhelming amount of material of these minuscules is just something wonderful. The textual critic has to look at thousands of pieces of Greek manuscripts when he's doing his research on the autograph. And so I'm going to say it this way. Since there are nearly 3,000 New Testament manuscripts of various kinds, uncials, minuscules, cursives, let me mention something here. And keep in mind as I talk about this, that the older Greek texts were papyri, not a very enduring, strong material. And only about 98 of those kinds of things exist, and they exist in fragments, pieces. And they date from about AD 250 to 300. And I think, if I'm correct, that they originated in Alexandria, Egypt. And we found them in that area because of the dry climate and the fact that they were not destroyed by the climate itself. And but when they came to the time to write on skin, or men could learn how to make parchment and then later vellum, then those manuscripts have lasted longer. And so some of them that we have on sheepskin parchment are from the around AD 900. They've lasted that long. And so you have 274 of these uncials, and 80% of them are Byzantine. And minuscules, 3,000. I don't know, is Kenneth Lake right? Or are Garcia and Nix right when they say it's about 2,700 or 800? Well, a lot of material. But when non-biblical papyri and pieces of pottery were discovered at a place called Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, about 1896. Those finds, not biblical, but they helped the Bible critic, the textual critic, know that the Greek manuscripts they had from that area were representative of the type of the Greek language spoken in the first century. And an archaeologist from England, one from America, and one from Germany, that's Moulton and Robertson and Deisman, they have shown us from archaeological evidence that the New Testament Greek was just common everyday Greek, koine. For a long time, people didn't know that about the New Testament Greek. They thought it was heaven language or angel language or something. But we know it's just common everyday language. But those non-biblical discoveries at Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, pointed that out. So the textual critic knows when he's looking at Koine Greek, he's got an early manuscript. He's got a really early one. And that is interesting that archaeology has helped a great deal in helping us discover the autograph. The medieval writers who had no knowledge of Koine Greek wrote about a heavenly Greek in the New Testament. Well, I understand that because they were not familiar with anything that looked like that kind of a language. The Greek they knew was a later kind of Greek, and so when we study Greek at school, for instance, we're studying New Testament Greek. We're not studying Greek so we can go over to Athens today and speak Greek to those folks. It's a different language, older language, common everyday street language, koine. Biblical ostraca, pottery sherds with biblical quotes on them. Papyri, there are inscriptions on catacombs in Rome. There are inscriptions on buildings. There are monuments with quotes from the Bible on them. All of that material helps the textual critic examine the language of the Bible. And it's amazing how much evidence is out there. It's overwhelming. You could spend a lifetime just studying the evidence for the Greek language. There's just so much of it. There are about 1,625 specimens, 1,625 pieces of pottery and other materials that I just mentioned that are known to us. And they have these inscriptions on them. Lectionaries, that's an interesting study. Lectionaries in the Greek language that contain Bible verses. They were kind of a responsive reading list for Sunday morning worship. Well, you have 2,000, well over 2,200 of these. Add those to the 3,000 Greek manuscripts, because now you've got more Greek evidence of what the New Testament reading was. The vast majority of the lectionaries are Byzantine. Well, that tells me that the vast majority of all that evidence in the Greek is Byzantine. And that's the background, incidentally, again, of the King James Version. Since the lectionaries were designed for worship, they were very carefully copied, even more so than other materials. And so we have an interesting background here in just lectionaries. And there's another source that the textual critic can use. And somebody said about this source that you could nearly do the entire New Testament just from the 36,000 Bible verses quoted by the writings of the early so-called church fathers. Isn't that interesting? 36,000 verses in the writings of the church fathers. Sometimes these fellows are called patriarchs, people like Tertullian or Irenaeus or Justin the Martyr or Chrysostom or people like that. They quoted great amounts of Bible in their writings and in their teachings, either verbatim or paraphrasically or by allusion. But there are 36,000 Bible quotations. Isn't that amazing? So you've got over 3,000 actual manuscripts. You've got over 2,200 lectionaries. You've got 36,000 quotes from the church fathers. And their writing patterns varied, just as the family manuscripts from Caesarea, Alexandria, and Byzantine, the Turkish area, did. But by the 5th century, there's an important point. By the 5th century after Christ, nearly everyone was quoting from a text similar to the one used to produce the King James Version of the Bible. And I've often wondered about the longevity of the King James Version. What happened here? These manuscripts are called minuscules. But when Erasmus did his 5th edition of his Greek Testament, he was using this family of manuscripts to do it, and that particular text is called the Textus Receptus, the received text. And again, people in that time were using that text that's very similar to the King James New Testament. So Justin Martyr, Tatian, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, Cyprian, Eusebius, and Jerome knew that text, and that's the one they were using. Well, let's do some definitions here for just a moment. Because we throw words around and technically they may not mean what we're saying. Let me say this, that technically the King James is not a version. The term version refers to a text that was translated from the original languages. The King James is a rework of the old Bishop's Bible in England. And so technically it's not a version. So when you use the word version, you should be referring technically to one that was translated from the original languages. It's also the case, a translation, it goes from one language to another. So if you went from English to French, it's still a translation. And that's the definition, it's very simple. You're going from one language to another. That's translation. Transliteration is when you go from this language and word for word into the next one. Baptizo, baptism. That's a transliterated word. Baptizo, baptism. In the King James Version, they have the word baptism. Well, the word baptizo really means to immerse, but they just transliterated it. Now, a literal translation, if you're going from one language to another, you're trying as far as possible to give the exact meaning, even the word order of the original. However, when you go from Greek to English, word order becomes a problem. So to try to translate from Greek to English, you have to arrange the word order so that it can come out and say what the Greeks said. The Greeks had their subjects toward the end of the sentence. In English, it's usually at the beginning of the sentence. So word order becomes a problem. So if you say, well, I want a literal translation, you may not. In that sense, if you wanted the word order to be the same, it wouldn't make sense to you to read it the way the Greek does. And the Greek always puts the word the in front of a name, or the God, or the Jesus, or the, always the, because they're talking about a specific being or person. The Peter. Well, we don't say that. And so we have to know what we're doing when we translate. Our students who start translating realize very quickly what the problem is. And so when you talk about a literal translation, when you're going from one language to another, your best thing is to give the meaning of the original sentence. That's what I want. I want the translator to tell me what the words are. I'll figure out the meaning of the context myself. I don't want him to put his theological bias in that translation. And so translation becomes an interesting problem. Now, the language from which you're starting is called the donor language. The language to which you go is the receptor language. So you go from the Greek donor to the English receptor, or you go from the English donor to the French receptor, whatever you're doing. But translation there becomes a problem. In Russia one time, one of the missionaries there said in his speech, as he was doing something very controversial, he thought, he said, well, I guess I just opened a can of worms. Well, in English, we know what that idiom means. I've gotten into a mess here. I'm causing a problem here. I just opened a can of worms. Well, the Russian translator stopped and said to the missionary, that won't translate into Russian. And so when you're going from a donor language to a receptor language, maybe the idioms have a problem. But when you try to do it literally, at least the idiom comes through. That's why you read in the King James Version, and it came to pass. That's an ancient idiom in the Greek. And it comes through in the English because the translators were trying to be faithful to what it said. But when you put your own bias into the text, sometimes the idiom disappears. And so there are problems when you're translating. That, to me, says that I want my Bible to be one that was worked on, translated, and the effort was made to be literal as far as possible. I like that because that's more faithful to the text. But today, and since about 1945, in fact, the effort that's done in translation is called dynamic equivalence. What does that mean? Well, in the preface to their Bible, the New International Version translators said, we have strived for more than a word-for-word translation. Well, being technically informed and having an idea of the original text and the original languages, that statement caught my attention. We're striving for more than a word-for-word translation. What more is there? And so the dynamic equivalent your translator tries to tell you what he thought it meant. No, I don't want that. I want it translated, not interpreted. Interpretation is my business, yours too. You're to give diligence to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, handling aright the word of truth, 2 Timothy 2:15. It's our task to interpret. The translator needs to translate. But when you have people saying, well, we're striving for more than a word-for-word translation, you begin to realize that sometimes the translators put their bias in the text just as the ancient scribes sometimes did. And the textual critic has recognized that error and corrected it. Well, we need to understand that all translation is not always good. And sometimes error sneaks into the minds of people through what's called a Bible. Serious Bible students should ask, am I using a translation that's more literal? I'll decide what the text means. And I don't want the translator telling me that. He may be biased theologically, for all I know. One preacher said in public one time that you can't base your decision on the text from the bias of the translators. Well, I think you can. And when I look at the preface and what they were trying to do, I can tell immediately that I've got a text here that may have a more than what the word actually says in it. Now, a version is a Bible that was translated from the original. That's a version. Translation, you're going from one language to another. You have a donor language and a receptor language. I used the term earlier in this session, recension. That's a text that's done critically. All the information about uncial, minuscule, cursive, family is given to you in that kind of a Bible. It's a critical work. So the word recension technically means that you have a very critically done Greek text. The American Standard of 1901 is a version because it was translated from the original language. But the King James, as I said, is not technically a version. So what do you call a Bible that's not technically a version because it's a redoing of a former kind of Bible in the same language? That's a revision. A revision. And the King James translators were revising really Tyndale's Bible from the Bishop's Bible. And so you have really a revision of the Vulgate here in the King James. But this is a revision because technically they were using former versions. The King James translators only had 16 manuscripts at their disposal in 1611. They didn't have the thousands we have today. And so they did a revision. And a paraphrase. Now, what's that? That's not a Bible. A systematic revision of the Greek text, a recension, is a Bible. It may not be the choice popularly, but it would be the choice of serious Bible students to have one at his disposal. So I use the American Standard Old Testament especially as my standard text when I want to check what the Old Testament said. I use the King James New Testament as my standard text when I'm looking at what the majority of the Greek manuscript said. But a paraphrase is not a Bible. It's a commentary. The two most famous paraphrases are J.B. Phillips' One Man, New Testament, and Kenneth Taylor's Living Bible paraphrase. And Mr. Taylor put his own Calvinistic bias into the text. And you can tell that immediately when you start reading it. It doesn't follow a translation method at all. It's a paraphrase, a commentary. It's interesting that when he got done with that translation, for some reason Mr. Taylor lost his voice for 2 years. Could not speak. What do you have now? A version, revision, recension, paraphrase. You have uncials, minuscules, cursives, all kinds of evidence from quotations from the church fathers, lectionaries, pieces of pottery, inscriptions, just tons of evidence for the credibility of the New Testament. There's no other book in the world that's as fully attested as to its accuracy, as to its original writing as the Bible is. The New Testament especially has overwhelming evidence, material evidence for its credibility. Some think that the first translation of the New Testament from the Greek was probably into the old Latin versions around AD 150. There is a website called Members that actually takes that position, that the old Latin versions were the earliest of the translations of the New Testament Greek text. I'm not convinced that's true. I do know that later in around AD 395, Jerome started his work on the Latin Vulgate, but the Latin Vulgate is Byzantine in its origin. The old Latin versions tend to be Caesarean or Western. Well, what about that? The Sinaitic Syriac is an interesting text. It's not a full Bible, and it's not Aleph Sinaiticus. This is the Sinaitic Syriac. It was discovered by Mrs. Agnes Lewis and her sister, Margaret Gibson, and they found this particular manuscript in Aramaic, or Syriac, in the same monastery where Tischendorf found the Sinaiticus, St. Catherine's Monastery. And so it's called the Sinaitic, Syriac. This Syriac Peshitta, common Aramaic, Syriac Peshitta, Syriac common, in my judgment, is a very early text. But the one they found seems to be a 5th century revision. But at the present time, everybody in the scholarship area is divided about that point. I do know that one of our preachers who wrote about Revelation took the view that that book, Revelation, was written around AD 68. And the primary reason he did was he had a copy of this Syriac Peshitta. And at the heading of chapter 1 in the copy he had, it said, written from Patmos, AD 68. He thought, the preacher did, and he had no other information but what he had at hand, he thought, well, that means that's the date of the book. And he thought he had a 2nd century text, because the Syriac Peshitta is older than the Old Latin manuscripts. The first translations were Aramaic. What that preacher did not realize was what he was looking at was a 5th century revision. Somebody wrote that on there. Later, 500 years after. And so he did not have a 2nd century text as he thought. And so his evidence for dating the book of Revelation AD 68 went by the boards after this discovery by these two sisters. That Syriac Peshitta, that common one, I have an English translation of that particular Bible in my office, but that particular Syriac Peshitta, in my judgment, that's your earliest translation, the common Aramaic New Testament and Old Testament. So you have an entire text now, and that entire text of the Syriac Peshitta is called the Philoxenian, there's a big word, Philoxenian, Philoxenian Syriac. And if you want to take a look at the earliest translation I know anything about, you'll have to look at that Aramaic version. Old Latin versions are wonderful, also old, but first into Aramaic. Well, that was a language spoken by the Jews. And so that would have made it possible for them to know the New Testament. We also have Coptic versions. Those are from Egypt. The Coptics, they still call themselves that in Egypt, Coptic Christians. These are Egyptians. They date about to the 4th century of the modern era, say around AD 350, 360. The Sahidic Coptic. The Sahidic Coptic Bible resembles our capital D Uncial, the so-called Codex Bezae. And so we have, again, the Alexandrian family of manuscripts. The Old Testament also looks like that. The Middle Coptic Bibles from Egypt are interesting because they're made up of 5 different dialects. And so if you knew all of the dialects of Egyptian language, I guess you'd be able to read those Bibles. But the Old Testament and all of the Egyptian Bibles, and it makes sense, are translations from the LXX, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, made in Alexandria, Egypt, in 250 BC for the Greek-speaking Hebrews there. And so notice how these families and manuscripts follow the area where they were translated. The Ethiopian Bible comes from about AD 350. Sometimes it's called an Abyssinian Bible. And when that Bible was translated from Greek into the Abyssinian language, and the people discovered Ethiopia mentioned several times in the New Testament, they applied that name to their country. The name Ethiopia comes from the Bible to the country, Abyssinia, not the other way around. And so it's interesting. This language in these Bibles is very Arabic, very similar to Arabic tongues, in fact. There are Armenian versions of the Bible from the 7th century, Gothic Bibles, German Bibles. It's interesting that those who translated the Old Testament for the Germans left the Book of Kings out. And somebody asked them, why did you do that? And he said, well, our people are already too warlike. Well, they belong there, don't they? We have Czechoslovakian Bibles, Persian Bibles, Arabic Bibles, Anglo-Saxon Bibles, and we're going to talk about those a little later. That would be the old Low German English Bible, old Persian Bibles, French Bibles. And some of these that I'm mentioning haven't even been analyzed by scholars yet. What am I saying to us? Out there in the world of general biblical introduction, there is so much information from versions, Greek manuscripts, in large letters and small letters, church reading lists, lectionaries, church father quotations, 36,000 verses. You just are overwhelmed when you take a look at the evidence. Is the New Testament credible? Look at the evidence. And as with all Old Testament textual criticisms, there are variations in the manuscripts, but the textual critic knows how to fix that. He knows how to work through that. And so all these versions, what's a version? Translation from the original language. All the extra biblical materials are looked at today by the textual critic as he searches for the autograph. That's why we've been telling you in these sessions that today the textual critic says to us, well, there's less than a whole sentence full of words that we're not absolutely sure about. And I told you in another session, when Brother McGarvey wrote his Evidences for Christianity book back in the late 1800s, he said then, it's less than a paragraph in our day. Well, it's less than a sentence now. These textual critics have been at work over the years looking for the autograph, the original, and their work is so helpful to us. What a science this is. The King James and the New King James contain a text that's more Byzantine in terms of its family than the others. The neutral witness, so-called textual critics, base their understanding of the text on the LXX, the Alexandrian, that we talked about just a moment ago. Westcott Hort, of course, opts for the two earliest ones, and so the American Standard translators did that. It's interesting that a man named John Burgon, and he's known in history as Dean Burgon, took on those translators of the American Standard Version. He didn't like what they were doing, basing their translation efforts on just two early manuscripts. And he has a book out, and it's been out for over a century now, of course. But he took them on in terms of what they were doing. And he called his book The Revision Revisited. And, well, that's kind of a slam at the American Standard. It's really a version, not a revision. But that book's interesting to study. It will give you an idea of the conflict between the American Standard New Testament and the King James New Testament and why we have these various efforts at translation. The neutral view says that when the papyri and the uncials agree, the true text is seen. That's an interesting thought. When the ancient papyri and the uncials agree, you know you have the autograph. Well, that makes a lot of sense. I've got a scrap here from AD 200, and I've got an unseal from AD 3, and they agree. I probably, no doubt, have the autograph. There is a school of biblical study today called the eclectic witness. And it's predominant among historical-critical scholars today, this view. And they say there's no family of manuscripts that you could view as infallible. Well, that flies in the face of what the textual critic's trying to do. But they opt for, in their opinion, that Westcott-Hort theory, the Alexandrian text. This method that they used, although has a thought in it, though, that seems to go against what they're saying. They're actually of the opinion that every manuscript we have came from a single source. I could have told them that. It came from the autograph. But the New American Standard and the New International Version and the Revised Standard Version, 1945, based their thinking about translation on this eclectic idea. Well, sometimes the eclectic idea falls into the trap of just because everybody says it doesn't mean it's true. Providential protection of the text outweighs any theory. My word shall not pass away. Matthew 24:35. True textual criticism will always take into account that God's hand God's hand is in all of these efforts. And every transmission of the text was providentially protected. When you pick up a Greek Testament and you read this text, and then down at the bottom are all these numbers and letters. The numbers indicate the cursives and minuscules. Here's our evidence for that reading. The large letters, capital letters, that's the uncial, except for Sinaiticus, olive. The minuscules are beautiful Bibles, highly decorated, wonderful artistic work. The best one is Codex 33. She's the queen of the cursives. The cursive evidence is made up of an Alexandrian style, a Caesarean style, and a Byzantine style of writing. And textual critical work tells us that this is what the scribe was doing. There's disagreement over the value of the cursives compared to the uncials. Yes. But a discovery at Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, helped the textual critic know that what he was reading was just common everyday Greek, koine. But we have lectionaries, 2,200 plus. We have church father quotes, 36,000 plus. We have revisions, versions, recensions, paraphrases. So much evidence at which to look. When you go to a store and buy a translation, let me suggest what you want to get. You want a translation, first of all, that's done by a committee, not just one man. You want to know that there was some input here from various scholars who are familiar with the text, and not just one man's opinion of what is said. That's very easily seen if you pick up the Living Bible Paraphrase. It's not accurate. It reads like a newspaper, but it's not accurate. That's another problem. Well, I want a Bible that's easy to read. The New Testament church was restored by the King James Version back in the early 1800s. Were those people better readers than we are? Maybe, given the way the school system is today. But easy to read may be dangerous. There is a Bible out there that's a comic strip Bible. It's easy to read, but it's blasphemous. It was intended for young people. Whoever the person was that did it really distorted the Word of God tremendously. And so you have to be careful when you buy a Bible. Let's get one. First of all, it's done by a committee. I still use the King James Version, although it's the 9th revision of the King James Version I'm using. It's been updated 9 times. It's not the original King James. The original King James is too hard for me to read. It's written in Anglo-Saxon English, and I don't read that very well. Ye olde shoppy is not the way I read the old shop. But it's the case that we have a text that's been restored from the autograph because of the massive evidence that shows us what that original was. Let me do a little review here as we come to a close of this session. In 250 BC, there was a discovery made at Qumran, as you well recall, and we call that discovery the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they are Hebrew Old Testament manuscripts that come from a pre-existing text. They are Masoretic in style. They have few variants. A lot of it is, the wording is identical to the Septuagint or Greek translation of the Old Testament. And the reason for this lack of variation in the Old Testament manuscripts is the strictness of the scribal copiers and their rules. When you think about the Samaritan Pentateuch, and you remember that that was a sect of people who were in the land when the Jews came home from Babylonian captivity, and a fellow named Manasseh started this religious sect on a mountain called Gerizim there in Palestine. Well, their Bible, the only 5 books, the first 5 books, can help us with this thought that I'm trying to get across here. The Samaritan Pentateuch, used by that sect of Samaritans, is available to scholars in copies. This son-in-law to Sanballat, Numbers 13:28, Manasseh, according to Josephus, actually built a temple on Gerizim. And you remember that when Jesus was talking to the lady at the well, she said to him, "Our fathers taught us to worship on this mountain." And Jesus will point out, no, it's not on this mountain nor in Jerusalem anymore. God seeks just true worshipers. But in that conversation, she said, "Our fathers taught us to worship on this mountain." Well, that's the reason that Manasseh took only the Pentateuch. He didn't want his people to know that the prophets said we should worship in Jerusalem. Well, but available to textual critics are 100 Paleo, very early, Hebrew codices of the Samaritan Pentateuch. And its marginal commentaries, incidentally, are in Aramaic. Now, when you have an Arabic commentary, you remember I told you in another session, that's a Targum. Well, there are some differences in these manuscripts, but very minor. So when an Old Testament text or critic takes a look at that group of 100 codices, he is able to restore the Old Testament text. That's interesting that providentially God was able to use a heretical sect to preserve the first 5 books of the Old Testament and let us know what he looked like and how accurate we are in saying we have the autograph. God is so wonderful. It's amazing that he could use that sect up there on Mount Gerizim, the Samaritan sect, and yet use it in such a way, even though it was heretical, to help us see what the Old Testament looked like in the first 5 books. And so we have the Samaritan Pentateuch that gives us an idea of what that text looks like. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, pushed our knowledge of the Old Testament back to 250 BC. But when you have 6,000 plus pieces of information for the New Testament, 36,000 quotations from the Church Fathers, and you start comparing Greek text, you have a wonderful source for credibility of the New Testament. Let me quickly make a point here. When I talk about differences, they're called variants by the textual critic between manuscripts. Well, they talk today about 200,000 variants in the text. That scares people when they hear that. And they say there are 10,000 places in these manuscripts where these variants occur. Wow, all those problems? No. If a single word is misspelled in 1,000 manuscripts, they count that as 1,000 variants. But they know when it's misspelled. There's no problem fixing that one. And when you eliminate the mechanical problems that the scribe caused, and misspellings and so on, those errors of the I when he went the instead of the, that kind of thing. When you eliminate all that, you know what you have left? You have 1/8 of the text, and that has some variants. And then when you eliminate the copyist problem, then you're down to 1.5% of the text with a variant. And when you eliminate what we can know now from comparing the text, you get down to 99.5% of the text is known. So don't let that number 200,000 scare you, because there aren't that many errors, but there are some misspelled words. 1/1000th of the text today is of any concern to a textual critic. What an amazing work. The credibility of the New Old Testament, scribal accuracy. Credibility of the New Testament, overwhelming evidence, overwhelming material, just thousands and thousands of things to examine. I'm praying that my brethren will recognize the need to have an accurate translation of the Bible when they study it, when they teach it, when they preach it, and when they follow it. And may God help all of us to know accuracy is everything when it comes to God's Word. My word shall not return unto me empty, he said. It will accomplish the thing whereunto I send it. Ever grow.